Tariffs, right. You hear that word, and it's kind of like maybe your brain just automatically checks out.
Yeah, totally.
Sounds like something for, suits in a boardroom somewhere. But honestly, those policies, they have a way of, like, sneaking into our everyday lives, showing up on price tags at the store, in our wallets. They mess with the entire economy. And you know what? You, our amazing listeners, you actually sent us something super interesting, notes from BillCara.com, about these new tariffs that went live April 2nd.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So we're going to use that as our starting point today.
I love that. Yeah, those notes from Bill Cara, they're like a snapshot of what people are worried about with these April 2nd tariffs. Costs hitting importers right off the bat, bigger changes in the economy, the whole 9 yards. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is take those really sharp observations from Bill Cara and expand on them. Use a wider lens, bring in some expert analysis. We want to really get a grasp on those ripple effects.
Exactly. So it's not just one person's take. We're also using this really in-depth report called The Impact of Tariffs on the Global Economy.pdf.
Right.
Gives us the big picture research. Think of it like we're doing the homework so you don't have to. We're not going to bore you with econ jargon, promise. What we want to do is really dig into what these April 2nd tariffs could actually mean for you, for the economy. Find some surprises, definitely connect some dots. So let's start with what Bill Cara was saying about costs.
Right. Okay.
He said U.S. companies, the ones importing stuff, have to pay these tariffs up front. And he's thinking this could bump up prices for consumers, maybe like 5 to 15%.
Wow.
What's the research say about this whole initial cost thing?
Well, what's interesting is that the research really backs up what Bill Cara is saying, consistently. Tariffs are basically taxes on imports. And what happens, those extra costs, they usually trickle down to us, the folks buying this stuff. And we see this over and over in studies, take the tariffs on washing machines back in 2019 in the U.S. Prices for the foreign ones jumped something like 12%. But get this, American manufacturers, they raised their prices too. Even on dryers. Those weren't even hit by the tariffs.
Oh, wow.
There's this one study that figured it cost American consumers $1.5 billion.
Wow.
And it only created, about 1,800 jobs? So it's not always this clear win for U.S. companies.
Yeah.
And shoppers, we often feel it in our wallets.
That washing machine thing, that's a good example. So in Cara's notes, he also asks about daily revenue and how this could play into inflation. He's clearly thinking short-term and big picture. What do our sources say about the inflation part of it?
So if you zoom out to the bigger picture, even the tariffs we already had before these new ones, they've had an impact on inflation. Like JP Morgan research, they say these existing tariffs have added about 0.2 percentage points to the overall inflation rate. Now, with these new tariffs, research from the Atlanta Fed, they're saying it could be even bigger. They estimate these added tariffs on stuff from China, Canada, Mexico, they could bump up prices on everyday things we buy, retail, by 0.81%. And what's kind of surprising is that the tariffs from Canada and Mexico are neighbors. They're projected to be a big chunk of that 45%. Shows you how tied together we are, even within North America. It's not just about picking on the big competitor countries,
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about those headline trade wars with specific countries.
Right.
And it's not just the finished stuff we see in stores.
Exactly.
The report mentions raw materials, steel, aluminum. How do tariffs on those things end up affecting what we pay for everything else?
This is what we call the cascading effect, and it's a big deal when it comes to how tariffs work their way through the system. When you slap tariffs on raw materials, steel, aluminum, whatever, it instantly makes things more expensive for all the industries using those materials. Like Deutsche Bank research, they're projecting that tariffs just on steel and aluminum, those alone could add 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points to core inflation in 2025.
Wow.
And that depends on, how much businesses decide to pass that extra cost on to us, the customers. Think about how much steel and aluminum are used. They're everywhere. Cars, cans of soda, building materials. It's crazy. So when those costs go up for manufacturers, it can also lead to inflation in services tied to those goods.
Oh, okay.
Like car repairs, parts of the food industry. And some economists even think that these price hikes could eventually hit things like used car prices, even airline fares, because companies are adjusting to keep up with these bigger inflationary pressures.
Oh, wow.
Let me give you a simple example. Imagine a can of soda, right?
Okay.
Needs aluminum.
Yep.
Aluminum price goes up because of tariffs. The can gets pricier to make, and eventually. That tiny increase can lead to you paying a bit more for that soda at the checkout.
Yeah. Yeah, that soda example makes total sense. And the report mentions some pretty big price jumps for consumers overall, right?
Right. The Yale Budget Lab, they have these pretty eye-opening estimates. They're saying the average family in America could see their yearly expenses go up by something like $1,600 to $2,000, all because of these new tariffs.
Yeah.
And they even break it down by category.
Wow.
Like gas prices, they could jump by like 40 cents a gallon in some areas. Fruits and veggies up 3%. Overall food costs 2%. Electronics a whopping 11%. They even said some cars could cost like 12 grand more.
That's wild.
Now, these are just estimates, of course, but they definitely show us how much these tariffs could hit our wallets. So taking it all in, we see a range of potential price increases. That JP Morgan estimate, 0.2%, that's one thing. But in some sectors, it could be way higher, like 12% or more. And those kind of like ripple effects, the inflation spreading throughout the economy, we got to watch that closely.
Okay, so then Bill Cara's notes switch gears. He gets into the supply chain stuff, worried about smaller import businesses, that cash flow, having to pay these tariffs up front. He also wonders if this could mean a big jump in demand for stuff made in the U.S.,
Oh, interesting.
maybe a 10 to 30% increase. And he's asking, which industries can handle these changes and which ones are going to be in trouble. What's the report say about all these supply chain questions?
So this is all about, the intended and unintended consequences of how things get from the factory to our shopping carts.
Yeah.
The report totally agrees with Bill Cara on the disruptions. Making imported parts more expensive, delaying them, it creates these like bottlenecks in making stuff. The goal, they say, is to protect American manufacturers. But then there's the risk of retaliation, which we'll get to. That can actually hurt those same industries, make them less competitive globally. Then you have businesses that rely on imported stuff. They might have to scramble to find new suppliers here in the U.S. or in countries without these tariffs. And that adds a whole mess of logistical headaches and extra costs.
Right.
The report specifically calls out industries with these super complex global supply chains, like cars and clothing.
Okay.
They're especially vulnerable to this kind of disruption.
Cara also mentioned that potential surge in demand for American-made stuff. Any info on how big that shift could be and which sectors would benefit?
Okay, so tying Cara's idea about the demand shift to what the report says about domestic industries. Well, tariffs are designed to give American companies an advantage. Remember when President Trump was talking about those auto tariffs boosting U.S. car manufacturing?
Yeah.
And the White House even estimated it could bring in an extra $100 billion a year. But the report also points out that global car companies, they're not buying it. They say those tariffs would be a huge headache and make cars way pricier for American buyers. Now, in the steel industry, the goal is to ramp up American production, like over 80% capacity.
Okay.
Some analysts are saying prices could spike, which would be billions in extra revenue for the big U.S. steel producers. And the idea is to also help related industries, like American foundries, by making imported steel less appealing.
But like that washing machine example, right? These supposed benefits for some U.S. companies, they come with some serious downsides for others, right?
Exactly.
It's like domino effect almost.
Absolutely. Some sectors might rake it in, but the report also says there could be job losses in industries that depend on imported stuff, like those higher steel prices. That can jack up costs for companies making cars, buildings, appliances. Makes them less competitive, could lead to layoffs.
Right.
The car industry is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Tariffs on imported cars and parts, those could actually mean fewer jobs for American auto workers, especially in the short term. And don't forget how connected the North American auto industry is. Even if the tariffs only hit assembly plants in Canada and Mexico, U.S. companies making parts for those plants,
Yeah.
they'd likely cut back, and that means job cuts here.
Oh, wow.
These parts suppliers actually employ almost twice as many people in the U.S. as the assembly plants themselves, so the impact is huge.
That's crazy.
Like Cox Automotive, they're predicting a 10 to 20% drop in car production across North America. And if those tariffs hit Canadian and Mexican parts too,
Yeah.
could be as high as 30%.
Oh, man.
So that paints a pretty concerning picture for those import-reliant industries.
Yeah, it does. So what about the jobs that are supposed to be created by these tariffs? Are those enough to make up for the losses?
Well, the Yale Budget Lab, their models have some interesting takes on this.
Okay.
They found that if our trading partners hit back with their own tariffs, the U.S. auto industry could actually shrink a bit. Less production, maybe around 500 jobs lost.
Wow.
But, and this is a big but, If there's no retaliation at all,
Yeah.
they think U.S. car and parts production could jump big time, adding over 150,000 jobs.
Okay.
But, and this is key even in that best case scenario for car jobs, their models still say the U.S. economy overall might not grow as much. Meaning gains in one industry don't automatically mean good things for the whole economy.
Right, right.
So domestic steel, they might see the revenue go up like 15%, maybe more. But then those potential job losses in industries that need those now more expensive imports, like we talked about with cars, it creates this like trade-off.
Yeah.
And it's not a clear win for the overall job market.
Okay, let's move on to retaliation.
Yeah.
Bill Cara definitely flagged this as a big worry. He mentioned the EU and China possibly hitting back, disputes at the World Trade Organization, counter tariffs, the whole deal. He estimates this could drop overall trade by maybe 5 to 20% and make things riskier for everyone, maybe like 30 to 60% more risky. What's the report say about this whole retaliation thing?
Well, that section in the report, it's called Trade and Retaliation, and it's totally on the same page as Bill Cara. The initial idea with tariffs is to cut back on imports, right?
Yeah.
But how it actually affects the total trade, including our exports, it's not that simple. Some experts are even saying tariffs might not shrink the trade deficit. They could actually make it worse.
What?
Yeah, think about it. Imports might go down, but then the U.S. dollar gets stronger, makes American-made stuff pricier for other countries, so our exports could fall too.
Oh, right.
Bloomberg Economics, they're saying these new tariffs could cut U.S. imports by around 15%.
Okay.
So less stuff coming in. And then there's the threat of other countries saying, hey, we're putting tariffs on your stuff too. That seems pretty likely.
Yeah, it does.
The U.S. soybean industry, that's a perfect and unfortunate example. Back in 2018, China slapped tariffs on our soybeans.
Right.
Exports tanked. Farmers lost tons of money, something like $26 billion between 2018 and 2019. And as of March 13th, China, Canada, the EU, they'd already announced or put in place retaliatory tariffs on a whopping $190 billion worth of U.S. exports,
Jeez.
targeting stuff like agriculture, American whiskey, the works. The EU, they want to bring back tariffs on those classic American things.
Yeah.
Jeans, bourbon, motorcycles. Their own analysts say a 25% U.S. tariff on their goods could shrink their economy by 0.33% in the short term because their exports to us would drop by 19%.
Wow.
So yeah, Bill Cara's estimate that 5 to 20%, maybe even higher drop in exports because of retaliation seems pretty spot on based on all this.
Okay, so what are the chances this turns into a full-blown trade war?
Right.
Cara said the risk is high, like 30 to 60%.
The report agrees, yeah.
Okay.
They're saying the current situation with all these tensions and new tariffs puts the chance of things escalating between 40 and 70%. The U.S. has even mentioned like huge 200% tariffs on booze from the EU.
Oh, wow.
Because the EU, remember, they're planning those retaliatory tariffs, and Canada too. Both of them already announced tariffs on billions of dollars of U.S. exports, mostly steel and aluminum. And J.P. Morgan Chase, they've even factored this whole trade uncertainty into their economic outlook. They say there's about a 30% chance of a U.S. recession in the second half of this year. And that's largely because of all this uncertainty around trade. And if you look back in history, there are some lessons there. The trade war with China during President Trump's first term, that shows you how quickly this tit-for-tat can get out of control. And further back, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the 1930s, that's a big warning sign, shows how these widespread tariffs can trigger global retaliation, makes world trade shrink like crazy, and makes recessions even worse. The report even says what's happening now is the second biggest use of tariffs since the 1930s. Other conflicts, like the U.S.-Japan semiconductor thing and the more recent U.S.-China trade war, those prove these tensions can drag on forever and really hurt trade and investment.
Okay, so let's wrap up with the big picture, the macroeconomic stuff that Bill Cara talked about. He was thinking about the overall effect on jobs, gains in industries protected by the tariffs versus losses in the ones that rely on imports. And he gave this range for the potential hit to GDP, a decrease of 0.2% to an increase of 0.3%. What does the report say about these bigger effects?
So the report has a whole section on that, macroeconomic consequences.
Okay.
It says the U.S. economy, it grew by 2.4% in the last quarter of 2024, which is decent. But, big but, it's uncertain if that can keep going with these tariffs coming in. Like Oxford Economics, they say uncertainty around policies, those tariff effects, tighter financial conditions, all that's already slowing things down in early 2025. JP Morgan Research, they actually lowered their prediction for US GDP growth in 2025 by zero point 0.3 percentage points down to 1.6%. And they specifically say it's because of the trade policy uncertainty and the expected effects of these new US tariffs and the retaliation tariffs from everyone else.
Right.
They also see a pretty big 40% risk of a global recession this year.
Oh, wow.
And guess what? They say it's tied to U.S. trade policy.
Oof.
And the International Monetary Fund, their analysis is even more intense.
Okay.
They say if the U.S. raises tariffs across the board by 10% and we get hit back by, big players like the EU and China, U.S. GDP could drop by 1%
Yeah.
and global GDP by about 0.5% through 2026.
Wow, those are some significant drops. Sounds like other experts are on the same page, right?
Yeah, totally. Goldman Sachs, they've changed their predictions too. They're expecting tariff rates to go up by 15 percentage points on average in 2025. And they're now saying that'll drag down their GDP growth forecast by 0.5 percentage points, meaning a growth rate of just 1% from the fourth quarter of last year to this year's fourth quarter, or 1.5% on average for the whole year. They also think the unemployment rate will go up at the end of this year, and they put the chance of a recession in the U.S. at 35%. The Tax Foundation, they say those existing tariffs, the ones under the IEPA and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, those alone will cut U.S. GDP by 0.4%. And that's before any retaliation. Looking back at that 2018-2019 trade war, they say those tariffs shaved 0.2% off long-run U.S. GDP. S&P Global Ratings, they're predicting that if the tariffs on stuff from Canada and Mexico stick around through 2025, we could see U.S. GDP shrink by 0.6% over the next 12 months. And finally, the Yale Budget Lab, they're saying those tariffs on China, Canada, Mexico, they could slow down real GDP growth by 0.6% in 2025 and the overall long-term GDP by 0.3 to 0.4%. So if you take all this forecast together, it looks like the overall impact on U.S. GDP growth is somewhere between a 1% drop and a potential 0.3% increase. But the general consensus is that it's going to hurt the U.S. economy.
Yeah. Mostly because of the disruptions to trade and investment, and because these tariffs are going to have different effects across different parts of the economy.
So we've really dug deep into what Bill Cara noticed and what the experts are saying about these April 2nd tariffs. To sum it up for you, our listeners, it seems pretty likely that importers are going to have to pay more upfront, and that's probably going to mean higher prices for all sorts of stuff we buy. The supply chain situation, that's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to encourage more stuff being made in the U.S., but those smaller businesses importing things, they could have some serious cash flow problems.
Right.
And some U.S. industries might do well, but others that depend on imported stuff, they could be in for some tough times.
Absolutely. And that threat of retaliation from our trading partners, that's real.
Yeah.
Could shrink international trade overall and hurt those industries exporting American goods. And looking at the big picture, the macro stuff, yeah, some sectors protected by the tariffs might gain jobs, but those gains could easily be wiped out by losses in other areas.
And the overall impact on GDP growth, that looks more likely to be negative than positive, which is, not great for the economy.
Definitely not.
So for you, our listeners, who want to understand this stuff quickly but also thoroughly, we hope we've done that for you.
Yeah, thanks, exactly.
We've combined Bill Cara's insights with all this analysis from the experts, so now you've got a clearer picture of what these new tariffs might mean.
And one last thought for you to chew on. Our analysis showed just how interconnected the global economy is.
Yeah.
So how might these tariff effects change the decisions you make in the coming months? Whether it's your own budget, thinking about those potential price hikes, or if you're in business, navigating all these changes in your industry, it's worth thinking about those bigger systemic impacts. It's not just about the prices changing on the shelves,
Exactly.
It's bigger than that.